This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Welcome to the London Seminar on Digital Text and Scholarship. I'm Willard McCarty. It's my pleasure to introduce Elton Barker, who's a lecturer in classical studies at the Open University. He has published widely on ancient Greek literature and is principal investigator in 3 digital classics projects, but he tells me nevertheless manages to get real research done. He's going to talk today about on the topic of discovering and using ancient place data. Unfortunately, the co-presenter, Leif Isaacson, had to fly off to America, I think it is. Europe flew off to
Continental Europe.
Continental Europe, and so can't be here tonight. So, Elton.
Many thanks, Willard. Yes, this is a typical Leif theme of just leaving me here to do the presentation. So that's my get-out clause in a way for some of the material I'll be doing raising, because he's the technical expert. So if we cannot have any technical questions, I'm quite happy with that. So, what I want to do is, I suppose, just kind of walk through 3 of the projects that I've been involved with, because I think each of them is going to be very interesting for thinking about the relationship between text, place, particularly from a digital perspective. So I want to start first of all with the Hestia project, which was a geospatial analysis of humanities' histories. Now, the digital aspect was just one aspect of that. What we wanted to do, there's a team I'll mention in a minute, we wanted to get a sense of, I guess, the cultural geography, you could say, of humanities' histories. And in particular, we were interested in the connections that Herodotus draws between places. Kind of a network analysis of textual relationships, not the usual kind of network analysis which is based on the archaeological data or historical data. Much more focused on narrative. So hopefully something interesting there regarding the issue of text and place, as I was saying. A great aspect of that was just good, solid, close textual study, proper scholarship, close study of the text, from which we try to get a qualitative analysis of the network. But we also wanted to introduce a kind of digital aspect as well, trying to use some digital tools to help us, I guess, pick our way through the text, and especially in terms of these networks that we're interested in exploring. And following on from that, we also wanted to experiment with using digital resources for representing and analysing geospatial data. And I really want to emphasise the analysing there. It wasn't just about representing the geospatial data in Herodotus and coming up with all these fancy maps. That was, for us, the starting point of analysis. And I'm going to stress that again as we go through some of the maps and graphs I'm going to show you. So don't imagine these visualizations are, if you like, the end point of analysis. They're rather, we're using them in a different way than perhaps a conventional map. We're using them as a trigger for further investigation. So here, that's kind of the kind of general overview, and the team reflected those interests. So I was principal investigator in this project. I have 2 co-investigators. Stefan Bezarowski from the University of Birmingham is actually a political social geographer, so he was coming from a kind of geographical perspective. Chris Pelling, known to all classicists, is kind of the godfather of Herodotean studies, I suppose, and Plutarch and many other things. So he was my kind of mentor figure, a great person to have on the project for guiding us back to the text at every opportunity, always asking that, okay, so what question, which is extremely helpful when you get a bit carried away with some of the tools. And then Leif Isaacson, whose name will come up time and time again, who on Hestia was the IT consultant, partly because he was doing PhD at the time, so he could only afford so many hours in his week. Partly also because of the IT consultant didn't charge too much, so we could only afford him for so long anyway. But you'll see that the IT aspect of this project then led on to other projects I want to talk about later. So first of all, Hestia and mapping the histories. So if you think of Herodotus as worldview, you might come up with something nice, especially if you go on Wikipedia. Here's the Wikipedia map, just to show that I do research now and again, as you were mentioning. And it's a kind of map that's easy to laugh at because it just looks so clunky, and obviously one thing we can do now is to kind of plug Herodotus into all these various digital resources and get much more sophisticated with your maps. But nevertheless, this kind of map, which is more of a mental map, is quite interesting for thinking in terms of how space and place is being configured within Herodotus' narrative. Nevertheless, there are a couple of, I think, major issues with this kind of map. First of all, it's too clearly defined in a way, related to different territories and different regions. There's Europe, Libya, Asia. There are some rivers there, but you get a sense of the world very much divided. And this was kind of the what we were trying to react against. Our thesis was trying to deconstruct this quite extreme clarity between East and West, particularly between Europe and Asia, and to start drawing out the network connections between these two continents. So we wanted to break down precisely the kind of divisions you see with this map. And secondly, I think following on from that this is just a static image. And I think what's really important when you're dealing with places and particularly networks and narratives is to remember that you're reading a story, that you have a narrative. The narrative takes you through time. And so we wanted to, if you like, introduce the idea of time into this kind of mapping investigation as well, and to get a sense of the world very much more in flux. And this is a world, after all, that's very much in keeping with Herodotus' own viewpoint, and this is the beginning of Herodotus, right at the end of his proem, where he talks about he's going to go through in detail different towns, and towns that were both great and small, because those places that were once great have now become small, while those that were great in his time were once small before that. So Herodotus is very well aware of this kind of more dynamic sense of place. So that's how. That was, if you like, the way that we're approaching this question of geospatial data in Herodotus. Now, like I said, the digital aspect is one element, and that's what I will concentrate on talking about today. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is where we got the digital text from in the first place. And you were just talking before about TLG. Well, we went to this other project, the Perseus project, because not only do they have a digital text there already, and this was we had imagined we were going to have to construct a digital text ourselves, so to find Perseus already had it was a huge leg up for us. But secondly, a very important principle of the Perseus project is it's completely freely available, and not just freely available for us to consult, but for us to use, and just as importantly, to reuse. And that's a really important aspect of Perseus, and hugely influential for our own approach to Hestia. So what we are interested in getting from this digital text were the aspect of placement. So I've given you here a screenshot of the first page of Herodotus on the Perseus project, and you'll notice that the first place mentioned here, Halicarnassus, where Herodotus is from, is in blue. It's underlined in blue. Why is that? Because the place has been annotated, it's been marked up. So if you go behind that screenshot, this is where we start entering the world of a more technical world that I'm still kind of learning about. What you see here is the XML, the kind of markup language behind the web page you're just looking at. And here you have the place identified as a place name. So with that kind of with the digital text annotated in this way, it's very easy then to grab all that spatial information, place name information, I should stress, and stick it into a database. And once you have a database, as you'll see in a minute, you do lots of funky things. The important thing, I think, here that I just want to two important things to draw your attention to is that, first of all, we wanted to try to say something about the particular place name that we were capturing. And we chose to have three categories. One was a category of a settlement, so Halicarnassus falls into that category, for example. It's some kind of town, and so settlement captures all that kind of information: town, city, cult site, something like this. Secondly, there are of course the broader regions beyond that. So the first one you'll see here is Greece. That's that's much more than a settlement. So we call that a kind of a territory, kind of some kind of place that has a lot of space. And that would include not just countries and continents, which are problematic concepts anyway when dealing with the ancient world, but kind of regions. For example, Athens is within the region of Attica, so something like this, or Sparta within the Peloponnese. And the third category are natural features. So here we're thinking of seas, mountains, rivers. With that kind of information, you can start doing interesting analysis of the number of times the place is mentioned, how many rivers are mentioned, what river gets mentioned the most. This kind of information, which I think is all very interesting for research. The other aspect here that I want to mention is that we give each time a place is mentioned in the narrative location identifier. That's the first column you see here. So Halicarnassus, being the first place mentioned, gets the location identifier 1. But when it gets mentioned again later on, it'll have a different location identifier according to where it then occurs in the narrative. And so with that kind of process, you then start not only being able to count how many times a particular place is mentioned, but you can also get that world in flux that I was talking about before in relation to the Wikipedia image. So once you've got all that information in the database, you can then start doing hopefully interesting things using current technology, one of which is geographical information systems, GIS. So these are all places that Herodotus mentioned as well. I should put all perhaps in quotation marks. This is all the places that we got from the Perseus text. Anyway. And we've color coordinated it so that you get an instant view of the different places, the different settlements that are identified by these red dots, the territories identified by yellow dots, and the natural features identified by blue. This should already be flagging out some inherent problems with this kind of approach. How can you mark a region with a yellow dot, for example? Where do you put the yellow dot? And that's particularly a problem when you're dealing with natural features such as seas or rivers. Nevertheless, you kind of get the sense. I think one thing that we did with rivers, for example, was try to place the dot according to where the kind of the narrative context of where the particular river was being mentioned. For example, when Xerxes is travelling into Greece, in his invasion of Greece, we tried to place the dot there, just in terms of kind of the narrative flow. But you get the idea. You can do more interesting things than just that kind of the static image and start to draw out some of the kind of scalability of this. So how many times, for example, settlements get mentioned, and you can represent that in different ways. So that I think we have here the 7 places, that get mentioned most often. This is a kind of a memory test for me. Delphi, Sparta, Athens, Miletus, Salamis Island, Sardis, and I think there's one other, Samos. So these are the places that get mentioned most often, and then again you get a quick visualization of that. And of course you can do this by book, by chat, however you want to do it. You have that degree of flexibility. We're dealing at the minute with GIS, and I'll mention this when I come to summarise, but that requires a certain degree of training, I found, as a classicist not used to geographical information systems and this kind of way of thinking. So we also wanted to try to explore ways that perhaps more intuitive ways of representing and thinking about spatial data, such as we might use and the general public might use in their everyday lives, such as using Google. So we went with that again with the same information from the database. We could plug Herodotus into Google Earth. And in fact, you can do this on our website. So if you go to a link on our website, if you have Google Earth already installed, you click on that link, your version of Google Earth will open up with Herodotus then magically installed in it. And then you can surf around Google Earth and look at all the places Herodotus mentioned and find out hopefully interesting stuff about. I think this is a pretty useful dissemination and hopefully teaching tool. So for example, here we're hovering over the Pontus, the Black Sea area. the number of scarily red dots you see here, kind of spiky diagram, that all the times that Herodotus mentions the Black Sea, Pontus, and we've just clicked on one of those, and this is a particular part of the narrative where he happens to mention it. Now, I think that was kind of exciting, but all very well, but it was moving us away from the idea of narrative. Because what you're doing here, you're privileging place over Herodotus' text. You're going, oh, I'm interested in this particular place, what does Herodotus have to say about it? Which is all very well for finding out what he or other authors, for example, might have to say about a particular place. You might have interesting mashups between Herodotus and Thucydides, for example, what they might say about different places. But it's not really saying anything about Herodotus' narrative itself. So he wanted then to experiment with similar technology that would take us back to the narrative. And here, in collaboration with a computer specialist called Nick Rabinovic, a web developer whose name will come back shortly, we developed the principle of a narrative map. So here you have three kind of reading panes. The main one being a kind of Google Map interface, with places mentioned in the textual reading pane on the right-hand side. So all the places mentioned in the text there appear on this kind of Google Map interface, and then underneath you've kind of got a timeline, or perhaps better, a narrative line at the bottom. And you can simply go through the narrative line or leap to a particular book and see the places then visualised next to it. What we've also tried to do, I'm not sure if it comes out terribly well, but you might notice that some of the kind of Google Map icons kind of faded out. And what we tried to do there was is again to try to capture the reading experience where you might be reading a place and it gets mentioned and it kind of lingers on in your mind. So the places that are in the Google, in the main reading pane, aren't just those in the text on the right hand side, but also an echo of those mentioned in, I think it's up to 10 chapters previously. So that's giving you again a sense of space moving through time. Places that Herodotus mentioned as he goes through his narrative, that kind of sense. Now the main, and I think again this has great applications, particularly for the teaching, and this is something I'm going to come back to in the second project I'll briefly be talking about. But our main thesis, if you remember, was to try to analyse the networks that Herodotus makes, the kind of the connections that he makes between places. Now, I also mentioned when I raised it the first time the digital resources we're using are only one aspect of the project. There's also a great deal of just hardcore textual analysis. And we chose one stretch of narrative for our textual analysis. That was book 5, an important book. It's kind of the hinge of the histories. It's not only the central book, if you want to think of books, but also it's both looking back to Persian expansion and looking forward to the Persian invasion of Greece. It's when Persians and Greeks come into conflict for the first time. The Ionian revolt is right at the centre of that book. So it's an important book, and so we thought, okay, that's a good book for us to kind of do a test run on the quality of analysis. I'm not going to go into that in any detail. I just want to show you if you like, the horrific result of our painstaking research, with this kind of sketchy monster that you see here. This took a lot of sweat and labour, and we haven't even got to start thinking about interpretation yet. Only possibly the sense you begin to see two groups emerging. The group centred around Athens and Sparta, groups centred around Persia. Perhaps no surprise, but it's a lot more complicated picture than you would have perhaps anticipated. So that's if you like what we're aiming for with Heskin. It's still something that we're writing up and we're still trying to analyse and interpret. We got to thinking, however, while we have all these digital resources at our disposal, is there a way of getting to this point a little bit more quickly than just doing the hardcore textual analysis? And the simple answer to that is no, but you can use a kind of network analysis with all the various caveats to flag up interesting patterns. I want to give you one example, which is this is purely automated from the digital text that I showed you before. And these are, we're looking at the category here of territories, so that kind of broader macro geospatial feature. It's not settlements, but places like Greece and Persia and things like this. And we've tried to scale it according to, we're trying to weight the lines according to how many, according to the strength of the particular connection. So the darker and the thicker the line, the stronger the network connection. And one thing that surprised us here was when we had anticipated that Greece would be the centre of things, and quite clearly it's not, it's Egypt. And then on reflection, of course, that makes perfect sense because Herodotus devotes an entire book 2, to the discussion of Egypt, and not just discussion of Egypt, but Egypt in comparison, nearly at every turn, with other cultures, whether that's Persian or Greek or whatever. So this is a kind of, there are two things here, I think, they're important. First of all, this is just a quick and dirty map. I'm using the words of Chris Pellin there, so there's a kind of authority figure behind this. So it's a way of hopefully flagging out interesting patterns that are worthy of further investigation. And that's really the point I want to emphasize, that this isn't meant to be proof of something, rather than the beginning of further investigation. It hopefully shows you something that you perhaps hadn't anticipated and encourages you to think a little bit harder about it and to pursue that. So these are I think the one thing that's still left to be unresolved, and here I think the challenge is, I just want to leave this with regarding Hestia, what we still need to think about is to try to bring together these two strategies. The very close textual analysis and that whole spaghetti monster that you saw before, and the much simpler at the minute automated network. If we can try to find a more sophisticated way of constructing that network, or in an automated way that gets closer to a textual, close textual analysis, I think that would be ideal. But that still wouldn't replace a textual analysis. I think at every point, every turn, you still have to have the text there to go back to. And that, if you like, is the lesson of Hestia. That we have some digital resources, we've been doing some interesting analysis, but it's a way to kind of pick your way through the text. Other things, I think we're an issue of technical expertise with GIS. I'm no GIS expert, and nor do I wish to be particularly. So trying to explore more web-based applications, such as Google Earth and things like this, I think they're much more intuitive. Interesting spatial concept. One reason why that qualitative analysis, spaghetti monster network, is such a monster is because we captured so much more information. The digital text had given us, because if you remember, the digital text just gives you a place name. Now, it didn't always give you a place name anyway. We went through it corrected by hand. And another really important principle with Percy's is that now we've corrected it by hand, we can give them back the digital text, and that's the one that they can then use. So I think that's a great way of reuse and the way that projects can build on from each other. But we also, because we were thinking more into the geospatial data more generally, we weren't just interested in place names, but also anything that might have something to do with place. And one important aspect here, and like I said, the one reason why that qualitative network map was such a monster, is that we introduced a concept of proxy. So a proxy would be either an individual or a people's representing a place. Because, for example, Herodotus would very commonly said something like Darius was in Scythia. Now, he doesn't want us to imagine that Darius, the individual, was on some kind of holiday in Scythia. He's talking about Darius and his Persian army in Scythia. So it's a very important spatial element there captured by the proxy Darius, but not captured in the digital text. So that was, I think, something that's very interesting to think about, the kind of the extension of space beyond the idea of place to this idea of proxy. And of course, proxies can be hugely problematic. When is, for example, a tyrant figure like Hippias, the Athenian tyrant, when is he a proxy for Athens, and when isn't he a proxy for Athens? These are really interesting questions, and again, so you always have to go back to the text and to consult the context. And just to emphasise about visualizations again, there's an inaccuracy about, where do you put a dot for a river or a region. There's the interpretation aspect. The maps are, in and of themselves, interpretive, and they are part of an interpretive process. They're not the end. Now, one question on the left is, can this approach be scaled up or applied to other texts? So that was the end of Hestia, although I'm going to say the end of Hestia, so I should say the end of the Hestia presentation. Hestia is still going. And we come on to now GAP, which is precisely that idea of scaling up. Now these next two projects I'll talk about more briefly, because I go over a lot of the same territory, but hopefully that you'll also see some how these other two projects have begun to take things in different directions. So first of all, the Google Ancient Places or GAP project, which is more generally investigating the geography of narratives from the ancient past, and not just Hestia. It wasn't just Hestia anyway. At the same time as Hestia was developing, there was a project called Open Context, and run by Eric Hansen from the University of California, Berkeley, who was taking the alternative approach. We had a text and we wanted to find places. His Open Context site is all about places, archaeological data, and relating them to texts. So it's precisely the other way around. Yeah? And so it's a free site, you can upload your archaeological data, and then provides a resource for everybody else who wants to find out about these particular places. So we were already in, we kind of got to know him and his project. We wanted to kind of get together with him. And then along comes Google with a kind of challenge. We have, we've now digitized all this stuff, and we want to kind of prove that it's useful. So here's a challenge to you, humanists. Can you use digital? Can you use Google Books for research or for your work? So we responded to this challenge. We put in an application to all about trying to discover ancient places and make use of them in Google Books corpus. We were fortunate enough to get some money. This is the team that's been extended and continues to be extended. So here's that Leaf fellow again. He turns up. This time as a co-investigator, and we've got some more money, and now he's taken over the mantle. Eric Hanser from Open Context. Kate Byrne is going to be very important in a second, from the Institute of Informatics, so she has nothing to do with the ancient world at all. She's a computer scientist. And Nick Rabinovitz, whose name I mentioned in relation to the writer's time map. And again, Nick's going to be great in terms of visualization of our results. So this is, if you like, the GAP team. And the question is, the aim is the there and back again principle, which I've already kind of alluded to with the different approaches that Hestia and Open Context have. So, for example, you might have a book and you want to find about the ancient places mentioned in the book. That's one way. Or you've got the ancient places and you want to find out about the books. That's the other way. And ideally, you can go from one to the other. So that's kind of the idea. And then trying to visualize, come up with visualizations that allow people to make best use of the results that they get. So they were really the twin aims of Hestia. Now, the two important processes going on here. First is the geoparser, and this is where Kate Byrne and the Institute of Informatics from Edinburgh come in. They've been developing anyway at Edinburgh something called the Edinburgh geoparser, which was applied to contemporary documents, contemporary place names. The challenge to again, we thought we were going to have to do this ourselves. We then, by chance, at the conference, met these people, so that we then gave them the challenge, okay, you've done that for contemporary place names, can you adapt your geoparser to look for ancient place names and ancient documents? So that's a big challenge. There are two aspects to the geoparser. I'm not the technical person, so I will simply mention them in passing, and hopefully not do such a bad job of explaining them. So first of all, there's the geotagging element, which uses various mechanisms to find a place in a text. And this is a purely automated process. Okay? So whereas with the Hestia text that we had from Perseus, remember that was marked up in a particular way. For sure, it was partly automated process of marking up, but there was also human there identify Alcanas as the place that you want to identify. This is purely now in the realms of pure automation. So there's the geotagging, which is to using various tricks to find a particular place in the text. That's one aspect. Okay, you've identified the place, but you then, to make it a place, you then have to kind of resolve it to a gazetteer. So you kind of look it up, find the place in the text, and then find its equivalent in a gazetteer, so you can then identify it as, yes, it's this place. So we've got the geoparser element here, and then these are the two stages of the geoparser, but you also then need a gazetteer. And it just happens to be an ancient world gazetteer, healthily online, that's Pleiades. One level you could say, if you like, they're the Barrington Atlas online, but there's so much more than that. And one way in which there's so much more than that is they've come up with this concept, rather they've used the concept that's known as uniform resource identifiers. Now, what does this mean? That means that they assign a code, a number, to a place. And it's a unique number. And this means you can then disambiguate between places of the same name, Alexandria. There are lots of Alexandrias where you can tell, depending on the Pleiades, the unique code for each of these Alexandrias, which Alexandria is that you're talking about. Also, it means you can give a place a URI, a unique code, without necessarily knowing its precise location. One thing that often comes up in the talks that I give is, what about this location, what about location? I can quite safely say that's not really our concern, that's Pleiades can worry about the location. But really, just as importantly, even if they don't have the location for the Barrington Atlas, nevertheless there's a unique code, so we can still talk about that place. And that's very important when you have all of these documents that you want to, that may be referred to as a place that you don't necessarily know the location for. So that means you've got, let's say, take three examples. You've got Athens, Rome, Byzantium, Constantinople, and these are the URIs for these that Pleiades assigned these places. That's all very well, but we're dealing with Google Books corpus, and we're also interested possibly in how early scholars, so when we're dealing with Google Books corpus, that means we can only go up to the end of the 19th century, because of the copyright thing, of course, but nevertheless there's a whole load of interesting stuff written in the 19th century on classics, particularly if you're a reception person. You might want to know how people have talked about Herodotus or the places he mentions, for example. And that's not going to be captured if they're using contemporary place names from Pleiades, because Pleiades only have, they have the ancient place name and they might have one or two equivalents, although this is something they're developing. But they're developing it through also some work that we've been doing, which is to add geonames to that. So the first instance that geoparser I was talking about before will try to look the place up in Pleiades. If that's unsuccessful, it will then go and look it up in geonames. And if there's a match in geonames, both to the mention in the text, but also between one of the geonames synonyms, because geonames have lots of names, and Pleiades, bang, or bingo, you've got your connection. So this is a way of extending Pleiades, and we've called it Pleiades Plus. This is a kind of loose kind of mark on Pleiades. And this is something that I think this is going to be a very important resource that we have to clean up and make widely available, because I think this is going to help lots of other people. That's kind of the basic principle involved. Now, what can you do? Well, here we have a similar kind of reading interface you saw before, although hopefully it's a little bit sexy now. We've had time to work on this. Nick's been really working hard at this. So this is now gap viz, but it's the same principle. We've got the reading pane, in fact, here we go. This is, if you like, more exact equivalent. You've got the text on the left-hand side, you've got the Google Maps interface with those places mentioned, and again the timeline at the bottom. Here, now, this is all automated. Okay, the text on the left-hand side is just simply grabbed from Google Books. Hence, some of it's, if you look too carefully at this, you'll see some problems with the text. Well, that's just with the material that we're handling, but nevertheless, I think it's very useful. Going back here for a second, you get a snapshot of all the places mentioned in Herodotus. And what's kind of cool here is kind of we use kind of heat map kind of idea. So the more places mentioned, the hotter it is on the map. And also you can visualize that all very quickly on the right hand side. I think it's called a cartogram. So you not only get a sense of the places that are mentioned most often, but where in the narrative. So you can instantly go, look, how does he mention these places, and look how often it's mentioned at the end. That's kind of interesting. Thinking how the artist is constructing a sense of Hellas as he's talking about the war with Persians, and so on. So that's if you like the snapshot. This is the reading view. You can have a live demo where you can go through this and you see the places popping out of focus. And you can also then go, so if you're here, if you go back here and you go, I'm interested in, I don't know, Athens and these places, you can simply take your cursor, click on Athens, and that takes you to place view. The temptation to put placebook is almost overwhelming for people who get sued, and people won't like us for that, so we'll call it place view for the time being. And this gives you a very, again, quick rough and ready network of places that get mentioned most often with Athens. Perhaps no big surprise, it's going to be Miletus, Sparta, Delphi, and so on. But there are also some interesting places, other links. And this is what I want to get to for the third project. We can kind of skip this regarding the issues and things, but a lot of it's come up before, and it's something that can come up in the questions maybe. But I want to just, while we're on that subject, the links you can start to have between things. That's what I want to leave in your mind as we now move to the third project. So at the minute, I've just been talking about text. This is after all kind of digital text seminar, but that's not all. So that brings me to finally the third and last project, which is called Pelagios. So, which we have a kind of, we get our catch lines getting better, I think. The information superhighway, the ancient world. I think it's kind of nice. And now there's kind of the team of three. There's myself, that guy Leaf again, and a guy called Ray Simon from the Austrian Institute of Technology, who's the main kind of the map guy. Now, what are the aims of Pelagios? Well, like I said, I was talking about text before, but there's not just, of course, textual stuff about the ancient world online. Classics is a truly interdisciplinary discipline. So there are lots of different projects online dealing with ancient place data, not necessarily textual, but maybe graph-based, maybe image-based, maybe database-based. So there's all this stuff out there. Well, how can you discover it? How can you link to it? So Pelagios is all about triangling together what's out there and using the principle of what's called linked open data. And there are two, I think, very important user groups here that reflect the aims of Pelagios. The first of all is to come up with a set of, let's say, principles by which anybody who's producing data, so here I'm talking about people who are more digitally minded and producing the data themselves and preserving it, putting it online. So coming up with principles by which they can make their data discoverable and linkable and reusable to other projects. So this is what we call super users, helping them to support and make best use of their data precisely by making it discoverable and reusable. So that's even like the Pelagios principles, and there's a certain thing like Pelagios compliance here. If you sign up, you're expected to kind of be compliant with these principles. But that's the super users. Obviously, each of these super users, and really what I'm interested in, because I'm not a super user, is what about me? What about me, the researcher, the teacher, the genuine enthusiast? So we're also experimenting with ways, again, of visualizing the data so that ordinary users can make use of these links too. And that's particularly, that again links back to the idea of the super users, because all these super users have their own constituencies. Perseus, for example, I know from having used it myself and also from my students, it gets used a lot in teaching setup. So Perseus has its own user group community, so what we're developing for Pelagios isn't just important to Perseus as a super user, but also for their own constituencies too. It's a growing collective, or family might be a better way to talk about it. That's how Leaf has started to call it. There's some popular names there. Pleiades, we mentioned Perseus, we mentioned Klaus, which is already some kind of collaborative network based in Oxford and various German institutions. There's Arachne, which is the German archaeological database. There's Numisma, so project dealing with coins. There's SPQR, which is a project running out of KCL to do with inscription. It's basically anything. And that's kind of what's interesting for us, is we have all of these different constituencies, all with different kind of documents. And we now have the Ur Museum, so that's not purely academic. We hope to have the British Museum shortly too, so it's a kind of continuing expansion of Pelagios. Now the basic idea here, and again, I'll just go through this briefly because it could get technical, and I'm not, so I won't. This is, don't try to unify the model, don't try to make your metadata kind of exactly fit with each other, because that starts getting very laborious, and it becomes too much of a system in a way. The point is rather to annotate, and you annotate precisely by using the Pleiades URIs. So here we have a text mentioning Athens and Sparta, and you annotate your data so that any mentions of Athens or Sparta in your data links to Pleiades, and through that link you're joining the Pelagios universe, if you like. So the Pelagios principles are: annotate your place references according to the Pleiades entries, these URIs, and then you publish them in a particular format. And that's where I start losing it. But the idea is that you present it in such a way that you can start. Basically, it's all about links. You can go from one place to another. And here I'm in more familiar territory of puzzle. If you like, each of these projects is one little bit of the puzzle, one piece of the jigsaw. Pelagios, you can imagine, is the jigsaw in entirety. So you can then start seeing how your piece fits in with other pieces, but you need to obviously configure your piece in such a way that it fits the model. And here are a couple of screenshots that, again, takes us back to that principle, the there and back again principle. You might have stuff to do with places, and you might be interested in exploring the relationships between places through the data. So you've got the places, you want to find the data that mentions them, or you can go the other way around, exploring the relations between the data through the places. So it's again that principle, from the place to the place, exactly. And there are a couple of issues here that I think are kind of interesting, relating to the partner's own data. Basically, the better the partner's data, the better the format they put it in, the clarity they have in it, the better use you can make of the connections. But there are some interesting issues already coming up for us, particularly when you start reaching out to these other partners who've got different kinds of documents. So, for example, I like the one between granularity and vague references. So, for example, South Italy or the Greek islands. I mean, how can you talk about this? And if you can't talk about it, then you can't discover it, you can't link to it. So are there ways of kind of getting around that? What about location-based adjectives? We can catch a comment, but can you catch Corinthian? That's kind of interesting and maybe a little bit easier to implement. And then there's the type of place reference. So this is a particular issue for archaeological data. We've got the find spot may be different from the origins, maybe different from where it is now. So all of these three things are all important depending on what you want to do as a user. Is there a way to capture all three and yet again not make it too overly schematic? So that's really what I want to aim with. So we're all about creating links, not kind of aggregating stuff, because that starts getting very complicated, and providing a toolkit for others rather than a single point of access. You shouldn't imagine that Pelagios is going to be a portal into the ancient world, because for one thing we don't have a sustainability model for that. Who's going to be giving? We've got some money at the minute, but it's much more, authority is diffused through the consortium or through the collective, actually. So each of the projects have their own sustainability models, and Pelagios, if you like, helps to support that, really by design principle. But it's about providing a toolkit for others, not to be aggregating all this data and become the kind of empire building thing for the ancient world. And yeah, so it's all about mapping data to vocabulary rather than kind of metadata to schema. And we think that we're helped by the fact this limited scope, actually, that we're not trying to do everything. And it's dealing with one particular issue that takes us all the way back to Hesiod, which is place, and how interesting place is, both for thinking in terms of the ancient authors, but also for thinking in terms of what you can do now with these digital resources. So, if you're interested, these are the 3 websites or blogs, as we're now getting into, for you to consult, and there's a lot clearer explanations about these projects there than what I've just given. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you.